Hi, and welcome to the Men on the Path to Love podcast. The Why Emotionally Healthy Men Don't Need to Win Every Argument episode. I'm Bill Simpson, your host. I coach men who are rebuilding their lives and relationships after breakup or divorce, helping them understand their relationship patterns, grow into the best version of themselves, and create deeper love and real connection, showing up differently for the next chapter of their lives, so they can live the life they love. So, as I continue my series on living as an emotionally healthy man, we're looking at the small mindset shifts and daily emotional habits that slowly transform relationships. In this episode, I'm going to touch on something I'm sure most every man has experienced. Have you ever walked away from an argument thinking, I proved my point, but somehow I still feel like I lost? Or maybe you've been on the receiving end of someone who always had to be right. Well, either way, here's the truth. Winning an argument isn't the same thing as strengthening a relationship. And emotionally healthy men eventually learn that. In this episode, I'm going to talk about why. But first, I'm going to share something that happened to me years ago in one of my marriages. I experienced something that shaped how I think about conflict today. The way I experienced my ex-wife was that she always seemed to need to be right. She almost always had some logical explanation, a counterpoint, another reason why her perspective made more sense, And most of the time, I'd eventually just give in. Not because I agreed or because she changed my mind. It was because I simply wanted it to be over. For me, it wasn't worth the emotional energy. It wasn't worth the drama. Keeping the peace felt easier than continuing the argument or the fight. Now, I'll also admit something about myself. There were a small handful of times when I knew I was 1,000% right. And those were the moments where I just dig my heels in. I couldn't imagine losing. It actually hurt to think about letting it go. And looking back, I realized that wasn't emotional health either. Here's what neither one of us really understood. Nobody really won. Whether she won or I won, neither of us walked away feeling closer. No, man, there wasn't relief, there wasn't any kind of understanding, and there certainly wasn't intimacy. Most of the time, when the argument was over, I just felt like I got slimed. Eventually, enough time would pass, we'd connect on the surface, and life would continue until the next argument. And frankly, it was exhausting. Because when the goal becomes being right instead of staying connected, arguments stop being conversations. They become competitions. Each person trying to collect their own evidence to be right, keeping score, building a case, instead of trying to understand each other. And man, over time, connection slowly fades away. Respect begins to erode, and if this dynamic continues long enough, contempt can begin to creep in. And as relationship researcher Dr. John Gottman has shown us, contempt is one of the strongest predictors of relationship failure. And that's how so many couples slowly drift towards separation or divorce without ever realizing they were competing instead of connecting. So why does this happen? Why do so many men think they have to win? Because some of us were conditioned to believe that something that sounds harmless slowly damages relationships. Yeah, man, we were taught that being wrong equals weakness, that admitting fault means you were losing. That if someone disagrees with us, we have to defend ourselves. We have to fix it, prove our point, and win. And for many men, being corrected can feel like being rejected. Our nervous system doesn't hear, "we disagree." It hears, "you're not good enough." So what do? We defend ourselves. Not because we're bad people, but because we're protecting our identity. And emotionally healthy men start to recognize that. They understand that every disagreement doesn't need a courtroom, right? Sometimes it simply needs curiosity. And this reminds me of someone I'll call Tarik, not his real name. Tarik was married to a colleague of mine. And occasionally our spouses, the four of us, would go out to dinner together. And after a while, I noticed something. Whenever my colleague, I'll call her Adele, anytime Adele would tell a story or offer an opinion, Tarik would interrupt. He'd correct a detail, he would tell a different version, or explain why his interpretation was actually the accurate one. And sometimes it was over something completely insignificant. It could be a date or a place, a tiny detail that changed absolutely nothing in the conversation. Yet somehow he couldn't let it go. And I could see the frustration on Adele's face every time. And it was hard not to say anything. And later, because Adele and I had a comfortable friendship, I asked her about it privately. And she laughed it off at first, saying, "Oh, that's just Tarik being Tarik. I'm used to it, no big deal." But I gently pushed back, and I told her that I could see the frustration on her face. Then I asked her, "How does it actually make you feel?" And she paused and said that it was embarrassing for her, that she thought it came from his insecurity. But she also admitted something else, that it felt controlling. She told me that whenever she'd bring it up, he would just get defensive and dig his heels in even deeper. And eventually, she stopped saying anything, not because the problem disappeared, but because she wanted peace. Then she said something that stayed with me ever since. She said, "Honestly, I feel alone in the relationship a lot. We're more like roommates than soulmates." And I got it because I'd been there. And it really made me sad for both of them. For Adele, it was because she felt emotionally unseen. And for Tarik, because I don't think he realized what his need to be right was costing him. He wasn't protecting the relationship. He was slowly pushing intimacy away. And even though Adele knew I worked with men, I didn't feel like it was my place to intervene. But I remember thinking, if Tarik had been sitting across from me as a client, this is what I would have shared with him about how emotionally healthy men handle disagreements differently. And the first thing is they notice the pattern. Every change starts with awareness, right? So it may help to ask yourself, do I always feel the need to get the last word? Or do I interrupt my partner? Do I correct small details that don't really matter? And how often do I leave my partner feeling unheard or unseen? And it's important to note that awareness isn't self-criticism. No, man, it's just information. Another way emotionally healthy men handle conflict or disagreement is that they pause before reacting. You'll hear me say this 100 times, man, over and over again. Yeah, it's asking yourself a simple question that can completely change an argument. Ask yourself, am I trying to be right or am I trying to stay connected? And by asking yourself that question, it interrupts the reaction, your automatic defense response. Sometimes you'll still make your point, and sometimes you'll realize it doesn't actually matter. Another thing emotionally healthy men do is validate before they explain. Oftentimes we go right into explaining. Validation doesn't mean you have to agree. And this is one of the biggest misunderstandings in relationships. You can completely disagree and still validate someone's experience. You can say something like, I understand why that would upset you. Or, I can see how you experienced it that way. Or, that makes sense from your perspective. And if you notice, by saying it this way, you're not admitting that you're wrong. You're simply acknowledging that their emotional experience is real. And people who feel understood become far more open to hearing your perspective. Another thing that emotionally healthy men do when they disagree or are in conflict, they become curious instead of defensive. And I know, man, oftentimes right out of the gate we want to get defensive, and that's normal. But instead of thinking about how you're going to respond and get defensive and preparing your rebuttal, say something like, tell me more about that. Help me understand what hurt you. Or what did you need from me in that moment? Because curiosity lowers defensiveness. Defensiveness raises walls and resistance and disconnect. Another thing is that they don't confuse ego with integrity. There are moments when standing your ground really matters. Boundaries matter. Your values matter, and integrity matters. But to be clear, this isn't about becoming passive. It's about recognizing the difference between protecting your values and protecting your ego. Because emotionally healthy men know that not every disagreement requires a win or a victory. Sometimes wisdom looks like letting go of something that simply doesn't matter. Okay? And one last thing I'll mention is that they measure success differently. Yeah, after a disagreement, don't ask yourself, did I win? No, man. Ask yourself, did we understand each other better? Did my partner feel emotionally safe? Did we move closer together or further apart? That's what emotional maturity measures. Not who scored more points, but whether the relationship became stronger. Now, if this episode helped you to recognize some patterns in yourself or to better understand a relationship you're in, I invite you to visit my website, menonthepathtolove.com. That's where you'll find resources designed specifically for men who are rebuilding after breakup or divorce and want to become emotionally healthier, create deeper relationships, and show up differently moving forward. Remember, you don't become emotionally healthy by winning more arguments. No. You become emotionally healthy by creating more connection. All right, and that brings us to our quote of the week. And it's from author and relationship expert Harville Hendricks. And he simply says, quote, "You can be right or you can be in relationship," unquote. Yeah, man, that's it. Yeah, because it doesn't suggest that truth doesn't matter. No, it just reminds us that if protecting our ego becomes more important than protecting the relationship, well, we may win the debate while slowly losing the connection that matters most. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Men on the Path to Love podcast, the Why Emotionally Healthy Men Don't Need to Win Every Argument episode. I'm Bill Simpson, your host. Thanks for listening. Now, as I continue my series on living as an emotionally healthy man, I want you to think about something. Have you ever noticed that sometimes your biggest reaction isn't really about what's happening in the moment? Maybe your partner says something, uses a certain tone, a certain look, or forgets something seemingly small, and suddenly your emotional reaction feels much bigger than the situation itself. Why does that happen? What if those moments are actually invitations to understand yourself more deeply rather than simply react? Give that some thought this week. And please join me next time for the What Emotionally Healthy Men Do When They're Triggered episode. And listen, if this episode you're listening to right now spoke to you and someone comes to mind who could benefit from hearing it, then please share the link and share the love. And until next time, keep your heart open and stay on the path to love.